Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 207, season 4, episode 47. I hope you did have a good week. I really do. It was not an easy week. Understatement, perhaps, of the month or the year in terms of the difficulty of the week that was here since we last spoke last week. It's just, and I fear that that's not over. The execution, the murder of the six of the hostages over the weekend just threw everyone for a loop, and it's an understatement too. Just sent the country spiraling. There's no other way to say that that's the case. Spiraling down, just horrible, horrific, terrible. And as I said, I fear that that's not over, as much as I think there was hope for some sort of a deal around that. I'm not sure that's going to be true necessarily anymore. I'm not in politics at all, but just reading what's going on. And also the reality that, heaven forbid, God forbid, that potentially more of the hostages will not make it out alive, and we will not see them, and we will suffer through more of this going forward. I pray that that's not true. I really hope it's not true. And I really wish and hope and pray for a resolution. Unfortunately, it's not there yet. On that heavy note, let's dive in. Our topic of the week is on strategic restraint. Strategic restraint. We'll get there in just a moment. Our one of the week here is, in spite of the pain, the opportunity over the last couple of weeks to celebrate with many friends at weddings. 3 different friends married off children in the last week and a half. And the opportunity to be part of their celebration, the opportunity to celebrate with them, even in the moment of pain, the opportunity to celebrate and to be joyous and to be happy in those moments is very meaningful, very powerful. And I think is one of the great things that we can do is to celebrate the successes and the joys of others, not just our own, to not be so selfish, to be a little bit wider, and the opportunity to get benefit, to get joy from other people's joy and other people's celebrations. So that was great, and may it continue forward into many more in the future. Our learnings of the week. A learning of the week here is simply this, not specific, but sometimes you have bad days and sometimes they really do stink and you feel it and perhaps you don't even know why. And the learning of the week is that you have to live with it and you have to keep moving and you have to go forward. Maybe you want to find a silver lining, you want to find one thing that worked, but by and large, sometimes you have those days, and from an emotional, psychological standpoint, even simply just an intellectual standpoint, you can't figure it out. You just can't, and that's okay. And you just move on. You move forward. That's a power learning, I think, for this week. Our topic of the week is strategic restraint. And I think that this is sort of a counterintuitive kind of thing. I try to do that sometimes. I try to do that a lot when I'm preparing and I'm looking for leadership principles. The counterintuitive I find sometimes to be super interesting. And I think when we think about strategic restraint, we'll appreciate the value of that kind of an idea here. So let's think about this in the following way. We think about sort of restraining and holding back, particularly in the space of leadership. So then let's use an example. This is an example that actually has come up in the United States over the last month or so. I think it's being misused to some degree. It's the example of George Washington not seeking to continue on as the leader of the free world, as it were, of America at the time, beyond the second term of being president, where he easily could have become the king of the United States, which was something he was desperate to avoid and something that he was not seeking. In fact, when you read the work on him in the biographies, I read a great one by Ron Chernow, he didn't necessarily want it in the first place. He certainly didn't want it the second time around. And when that was over, he made it abundantly clear that this was to be a democracy different, altogether different than every other country in the world at the time, and refused the power, refused the seat, refused the opportunity that was there. It's an incredibly powerful lesson in leadership. The reason I mention it in the context of now is I think that people are trying to paint, again, I'm trying not to be political, the current president of the United States in the same light as George Washington by not seeking he's not George Washington. I mean, simply not the case. And when all things, I believe, are told as to what exactly took place over the last number of weeks and months, I don't think it'll shed such great light on our leaders, all of them, and the manner in which that went down and how that happened. And let George Washington sort of stand as George Washington. In the Bible, we have Gideon, who's in a similar space after winning a war and clearly showing himself to be an incredible leader and incredibly righteous person, is also effectively offered kingship, and he also refuses that seat. George Washington-esque, or George Washington is Gideon-esque, let's say. Current situation, perhaps not. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe history will say it that way. But I think there's an important thing here with respect to leadership, that leaders are always trying to expand the size and space and scope of their power, or the size and space and scope of their reach and their wealth. And perhaps on occasion it is better to restrain, to hold back, to accumulate less. And that in such a space, maybe more isn't always the best path, and maybe more isn't always good. And part of the reason is maybe the moral lapses, the ethical lapses that might come in, the burnout, the crises that might ensue by continuing to move and operate in that moment, but perhaps sort of stepping back and strategic restraint as a leader for one's own leadership, for one's own gains, the team. And I think that's an important sort of concept, which I think is counterintuitive to some degree, especially in the current climate where it's very much about consumption and about the haves and the haves and the haves and being one of the haves. And so let's look at the Bible as our sort of jumping off point, as we always do, and specifically the role of the king that's brought up in this week's portion, the portion known as Shoftim, where the king of Israel is for the first time described. Leading through the Bible itself till this point, I'm not sure it's obvious that a king would be part of that puzzle. Yes, Moses is effectively a king, but he's certainly not the king. And we never call him the king Moses. That never happens. And so appreciate that when the Bible brings up the idea of a king for the people of Israel, that it has rules and it has regulations and it has built in very specific leadership structures and styles that are absent most leaders in the ancient world, and some leaders today as well. And so the model that's set up is sort of very opposite as to what they've experienced so far in having been the children or the slaves in Egypt under the Pharaoh, the other kings that they have witnessed over the course of time in their battles with the king of the Amorites, Og, as they're about to experience as they go into the land, as to how those people are and what they're about. The Bible limits it very much, because the role of the king of Israel is not to be a consumptive person, but rather focused on morality, spirituality, justice, humility, ethical governance, and not personal power. It's, on some level, very much a high-level servant leadership. And when I think about the idea of responsibility and accountability from a national standpoint, that's really what this role is. And it's not for the self, it's for the collective, it's for the group. And so by setting in these ethical restraints, these moral restraints on wealth and consumption, the Bible is setting in motion a different kind of model for leadership. And so the Bible tells us effectively the three no's of the king of Israel. No number one is no multiplying of horses, not having an abundance of horses. Number two is in not accumulating wealth. a preventative measure on the amount of wealth that a king can have. And the third one is on sort of conscripting and restricting the number of wives that a king could have. Each one of those has a specific explanation to them. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But sort of the idea here with respect to horses is avoiding the reliance on military power, thinking that just by having many horses and having, let's say, a large army today is all that you need. Not true. Number two is in the restricting the accumulation of wealth is to hope to prevent some level of disconnection from the people, the have, one singular have, and all the rest are have-nots. Admittedly, though, when you look at the law as brought down, Maimonides codifies a lot of the laws. The king is certainly to look a certain way, to dress a certain way, to behave a certain way, to live a certain way, no question. And it is distinct and separate from the people. At the same time, the non-accumulation of personal wealth, to sort of think of the Scrooge McDuck example, where he's swimming in his own bank of money. That's what we're looking at. And the third one is very much to avoid the distractions and perhaps political entanglements that may come with the multiplicity of wives that we do see later on in the Bible with Solomon. And so these kinds of things are very much sort of the outlier, as it is the case with the leaders of the ancient world and even some of the despots and the kings today, serving it very much as a model of humility and service rather than personal ambition and personal consumption. And so this is really important. And it's really relevant for today. When we think about the leaders and the leaders that we're trying to have, that we hope to have, that we would like to see reflect us as citizens, we would want leaders who are servant leaders, leaders who are focused on providing the best opportunities for the people, to protect them, to put them in positions to succeed, to lead them through humility and service rather than their own power and their own gain, as it were. So let's zoom in then specifically this week on the non-multiplication of horses. It's a sort of, it's not something that we think of now, but in terms of having a lot of horses, how many of us actually have horses? I mean, I don't. If you weren't sure, I don't. But horses are symbolic of military strength, of raw physical sheer power. And limiting the number, where they talk about in the Talmud that even having one too many is too many, is really important. It pushes the leader to find strength and ability not in accumulation, but rather through their ability to restrain. It's a very powerful sort of an idea. When we think about it that way, the ability for the king to lead and to lead properly and to lead best is not through raw sheer power or accumulation of assets and weaponry, but rather through their ethical guidance, through their values system, through their, in this case, because it's the case that the person who is the king of Israel is the king of the Jewish people, there's a divine guidance that's supposed to be there. It's very much a rejection of the power-driven models, of the tyrannical leadership models, of the idea that the king is God, as you might have had with the pharaohs in Egypt. And it very much depends and focuses and pushes towards moral authority. This then keeps the king tied to his ultimate true purpose, which is serving the people and maintaining justice throughout the land. Very powerful setup, very powerful structure. It's hard for us to imagine, admittedly, because, none of us have ever seen a king of the Jewish people. It's simply not the case, or a king of Israel. And admittedly, when it worked, it only worked for a very short period of time, where the paradigm of it being in place. And so we're sort of hoping for that time in the future. Maybe we can imagine and think about what it might look like in the future. We don't have it now. There was a book a number of years ago, a novel written by Rabbi Gideon Rothstein. It talked about a murder that took place, but it takes place in the future. So it takes place after the Messiah has come and after that kingdom and monarchy has been established. And so I mention it here because it's super interesting to read how he thinks about the narrative of what that might look like and how you might want to think about it in the future. Anyway, that's a side point. But let's keep this in mind, what we're trying to do. And appreciate the idea here that the Bible is teaching us, and what we want to learn as leaders, is that restraint isn't just a rule. Restraint is a value. Restraint is a value. And so limiting consumption, limiting waste, limiting the power nature of a lot of people forces us to focus on others, giving others power, forces us to focus on other ethical qualities and values that we may have, the grounded principles that we're looking to share, that we're looking to expand upon, rather than our own personal ambition. Now, yes, to some degree, any person who's going to seek out a leadership position has ambition. But what is it that encases that ambition? What is it that builds that ambition? What is it that the goal of that ambition is really, really important? So we could lean on some of the philosophy and understanding what's going on here. For Aristotle, particularly as an example, right, the famous golden mean, that virtue lies between the extremes, which, is not his idea perhaps alone, but the quote is basically this: what lies in our power to do, it lies in our power not to do. And so that very much captures the idea of restraint. The strength of character to choose sometimes not to act, even when you have the power to act, right? Imagine something happens to you where you are profoundly embarrassed or mocked in public, and you have the power to do something, and in fact you choose not to do something. That restraint is incredibly powerful. When you have a moment to yell, to scream, to share what you're saying out loud, and you hold back. My students used to tell me when I was a teacher that what scared them more was not when I lost my cool, but was when I kept my cool, knowing that I could lose my cool in those moments, and then I would go into sort of whisper mode as opposed to yelling mode. For my students, that was worse than actually unloading in those moments. And so there's some philosophy here that's important. There's also psychology here that's really important. That also, in the case of a leader, that when you have what's called the paradox of choices, so then it causes too much of a problem. Paradox of choices, generally speaking, talks about when you have too many options, it often leads to worse decisions. So having too many products to choose from isn't necessarily always better. It can cause some sort of like an overload, and you make less thoughtful and less strategic choices in those decisions. So you have to really appreciate how that works. It's a great quote from Lao Tzu: "He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." And so really restraining in general, but also in the space of leadership, really helps. It helps you as a leader to enhance the quality of your decisions. It helps you as a leader to align with your long-term goals. It helps you as a leader to prevent ethical drift. And so you really get to stay focused in on what the goal is and what the North Star might be, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish and who you're trying to accomplish it for. And as a result, you raise the level of your credibility, you raise the level of your trustworthiness, you raise your level of your commitment to your core values, and by extension, you drive greater impact, you drive greater success, and you drive a greater culture around the team that's around you. It's really important to sort of think about that in that way. As an example of it to some degree, and he maybe exemplifies this in a lot of ways, as Warren Buffett, because just of the manner and way he lives and operates, it's very much a restrained model. The man has more assets than most people will ever have by magnitudes that are hard to even imagine in terms of dollars and assets. And yet he lives a very simple life, very disciplined and simple life. And his strategy for investment is also very disciplined and very, quote unquote, savvy, but very simple. And he stays true to his principles all the way through. So here, when we're looking to do this as a leader, it's really important to sort of appreciate how we go about this and how we sort of look at this and how we create opportunities and moments to hold back rather than to sort of throw money at the situation. Imagine yourself as the leader of a company or coming into some sort of new assets, new wealth that you didn't have before. And how do you handle that? Or the reverse, where you find yourself as a leader and you're in a moment where your product or your company is lagging and underperforming. Now, how do you handle that? What do you do to fix it? You're going to go for some sort of a high risk marketing blitz. You're going to sort of throw money at the problem, or maybe you're going to look at some sort of a more restrained approach that leans into the assets that you have, that leans into the people that you have, and you get creative from within. I just had that conversation with somebody, with a client this week, within, which aligns more with who you are and the values that you're trying to present and the leadership that you're trying to get there. So you practice restraint that perhaps ultimately leads to your greater success. And so that's a really powerful way to sort of think about it. And so how do you do this as a leader? Number one, really important, basic 5-step structure. I know I'm running late at the time here. Reflect on your core values. Really align your decisions with your core values. Think about where the things are that you're doing. Where do they fit within what it is that you're trying to overall do? And sometimes they fall outside the lines. And then it's an opportunity for you to zoom back in, to tighten the belt, to restrain a little bit more. And then go back and try to build the limits in, re-engineer the situation so that sort of drift doesn't happen next time. Number 3 here is to seek the input of others. Maybe you have somebody who's sort of like your restraint consultant, right? Somebody on the team, let's say, or somebody in your house, let's say, who can maintain objectivity in these moments and allow you to, even if you're straying, they hold you back, they rein you in, and you allow them to do so. That's really powerful. And then obviously you're setting up metrics that are not just metrics on numbers in terms of your growth, but maybe look at how you metric out how you think about your restraint strategy, where you could have done something, you held back from doing it because it didn't align with your values, didn't align with what you're trying to do, it didn't align with your long-term goals. And to be really open about it. I think there's a lot of ways to really implement on this and to really do this, to use that scorecard kind of a concept where you're tracking where you restrain. You can do this anywhere from holding back from having dessert, from holding back to saying something that you shouldn't say, and marking yourself, giving yourself a check in the box for having not done something in a moment. That's strategically done, so you held back in that moment. Again, really appreciate that restraint is not a limitation, but it's actually what I think is a leadership superpower. It can allow you to build a really much greater legacy as a leader, really powerful impact on everyone else, and really helps you focus on what truly matters and what it is that you're truly trying to serve ultimately in this world. As always, I'll leave with a quote. This week's quote comes from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and it goes like this: "In character, in manner, in style, in all things, the supreme excellence is simplicity." The quote encapsulates everything I think we're trying to discuss today. Restraint, simplicity, ethical clarity, which are the hallmarks of great leadership. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, I wish you and bless you that you have a wonderful, amazing, incredible week ahead. I look forward to seeing you next week with another episode of Coaching the Bible and only good tidings and good news.